Got it.
Hello, Meg.
Hello.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm super excited to geek out on facilitation with you.
Yes, I am excited about anybody who wants to do that. And I'm excited because you've spent a lot of time geeking out about facilitation with facilitation geeks. So like maybe, I don't know if you would consider yourself an Uber geek, but it feels up there.
You were definitely the first who introduced yourself as a facilitation geek. So yeah. I'd be curious, when did you start calling yourself a facilitator? When did you move from being a facilitator to a facilitation geek? And what does it actually mean?
So I started doing facilitation and what I thought of as facilitation in college. I was doing gender and sexuality workshops. And then I was also part of a group of people who were facilitating incoming students to take them out on wilderness trips as part of their kind of orientation program, which I think more smaller colleges in the US, at least in the Northeast, that's actually quite popular to have basically some sort of trip experience at the beginning of your college experience. And so I also was part of like leading students on those trips. And we used the word facilitator, or we talked about facilitation in that context. And then also in my like social justice, gender and sexuality trainings, I very much saw myself as a facilitator rather than like a teacher or a trainer. I don't know why, probably because of that experiential piece. And I think that, when did I become a facilitation geek? I would say like in college, I started teaching other people how to do it. So before I graduated, I was teaching people how to lead gender and sexuality trainings because I went to a very small college, like there were no professional staff doing this. And so I was like, I don't want this program to die when I leave. I'll run a trainer. I've done 20 of these things or 30 of these things. Like I can teach other people how to do it. And so like, I don't know, I had the analysis of what made that work and what made good sessions and bad sessions. And I knew it wasn't the content, that the content could be the same every time. But like, if you say like, does anyone have any questions? You'll get crickets. But if you say, everyone write down a question on an index card and pass it in, you'll get 10 questions. And so like, even in, that was junior year of high school, I learned that, or college, I learned that lesson. And that to me was so clearly like, oh, this isn't the content, this is actually the process, and how you do it really, really matters. And then I went to a conference called the Association of Experiential Educators, which I still go to. It's a lot of like outdoor wilderness adventure educators, some wilderness therapists, but a lot of people who just like really believe that you can have an experience and you can learn something from that experience and from like debriefing or understanding that experience. And those people are all facilitation geeks. They're like, some of them are like group game geeks. They're the people who have like 50 different games that they can do with like, one little ball or whatever. And that was also like really influential in just seeing how people did different things, and that I wasn't the only one writing down how people were doing things, not just the content that you were there to learn. I was like, that guy does intros good. That guy does, that person is really good at bringing people back together when they go off track and like taking notes on that stuff. And to me, if you're a person that takes notes, not on the content of the workshop, but on the process, you're probably a facilitation geek.
The meta level of the experience.
Yeah.
And I'm intrigued about the example that you gave, which is so obvious. Ask a group, does anyone has a question? And everyone shows up. What made you realize that? Did you read books about facilitation to get the training, or was it learning by doing, or just observing what's happening?
It was all trial by fire. It was all getting it wrong and caring in a way that made me really want to get it right. For me, about the topic that I was doing, I was really passionate about people understanding gender and sexuality. And I knew that like I felt very much like if I can do this well, it can have a real and lasting impact. And there was a particular workshop for that one where I was like, man, this workshop is like cruising. We're doing so well. Everyone's talking, everyone's excited. And like people are surprised that they're learning things. They thought they were going to be, like they thought they were going to know everything and they didn't. And then I remember being like, I always did anonymous questions with like index cards, in person. And I was like, this group doesn't need that, like, I bet we can just do this out loud. And so I was like, all right, so we usually do anonymous questions, but I think we're like comfortable with each other, like, what questions do you all have? And just no one had any questions. And I was like, oh, like, I knew in that moment, like, if workshops that were going less well than that asked me questions, it was the form, it was the invitation and the process of that invitation that really mattered, not do they have questions or not, because I knew these people were invested in all of those things. So yeah, I didn't learn, I mean, I had a mentor in college that was the person who ran the orientation or the outdoor orientation program, like outdoor leadership, and that person taught us facilitation or and leadership. That was like my formal exposure, but that wasn't in-person classrooms. That wasn't a person who specialized in like training. Everything else was trial by fire, learning as I do, and then working with other facilitators and like picking things up from them or paying attention to that meta level process, and then just doing it a lot. And I now create a lot of resources so that people don't have to learn that way, because I think that there was a lot of learning I could have expedited, that somebody who's never facilitated before could be like, got it. Don't ask people questions, like don't ask open-ended questions, just like give them index. That's great. I can do that, and you don't have to miss the 10 opportunities it took me to learn that. So.
And it's so funny how sometimes we step into this trap of, oh, now I understand the group dynamics. And as you said, we can do it like this, but it's basically, for me, it's also the awareness that the human brain works in a certain way. And there's no hack around that. So it is so vulnerable to just raise your hand and to ask a question in a large group and to go first. And I think especially online. So if you even take away this moment of turning to your neighbor and just making sure that the question you're asking is not super stupid. What I like to do is if the group is not too big, to go around and say, everyone ask one question. And if you cannot think of a question, then ask about the weather for tomorrow. But everyone can think of one question to take the friction out and then to answer all the questions at once. Because I also realized that if we go into this question and answer ping pong and answer them right away, suddenly the time is up and we didn't get the chance to listen to all of them.
Yep. I love that. And it's very similar. One of my friends who does a lot more speaking, he's a brilliant facilitator, but he's also a good speaker. When he's doing like a Q&A section, or I think even at the end of his workshop, sometimes he'll have people do that kind of question dump, and he'll frame it as like, I just want you to dump your questions for like the next 2 minutes. And then I'm going to filter them and like answer the ones I can, or like theme them, and answer them in order. And I just thought it was really clever of him, because it allows him to like answer the questions that he wants to, answer them in groups, like, segment out all of it. Like it gives him so much more agency, rather than like, who has a question? Great, will you do your question? And it could be a question you don't want to answer, and you're like, I can't be like, bad question, next question. Like you can't do that unless you get them all at once, whether that's out loud or in the chat.
Yeah. And also it might inspire the group to come up with other questions that are somehow related. And that they might not have thought of, but suddenly they feel encouraged to ask that.
Totally.
Yeah. For me, that's one of the high art of facilitation skills, this thinking on your feet, to be able to cluster and to screen all the questions and to then see a general theme and bring them together.
Yeah. Sometimes, I mean, to give myself more, I did this recently in a workshop where I had people ask the questions they were coming in with, and then I gave them small group time, and then I went and looked at all the questions and I answered the questions later. And you can't always do that, but like you can often get yourself 10 minutes or 5 minutes, you know, like before we go to a break, let's do this. And just buy yourself a little more time, because being brilliant at that, I think, can take practice, but also like if you give yourself 10 minutes, everybody will get better at it. You know what I mean? Like it's the pressure of the 2 minutes that's really, really hard.
Absolutely. And usually the group, they enjoy these breakout sessions to just have a little bit more time to reflect. And even if you just send them off with the prompt, okay, what was your favorite question of all of those? Or how would you answer them? This will basically occupy them for 5 minutes.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's something that people underestimate as facilitators, is how much you have to, like, we're very, very oriented towards the group, but I think sometimes you have to carve out space for yourself, and you have to actually make decisions based on what you need in order to serve the group. Like when I did a workshop on emergent facilitation, which is what I think of as like kind of building as you go. And I was like, the only thing that allows me to do that is giving myself breaks to figure out what the next step is. And a break doesn't have to look like time off. A break can just be small group work. It can be solo reflection time. It can be whatever. But I think that is often novel to newer facilitators, at least, is the idea that like you sometimes make decisions not because the group necessarily needs it, but you need it in order to serve them or to be present for them.
I love that. And thank you for pointing that out. It reminds me of the concept that you need to host yourself first before you can host a group.
Sure. Yeah.
And yeah, because if you are not in a position where you can really think on your feet and plan the next move, then this nervousness or clutter will spill over to the group.
Totally. Yep, absolutely.
And from what you shared earlier, two things came to my mind that I would be very curious to explore. One is when you shared that in the beginning of your facilitation work, you were so enthusiastic about the topic of gender and sexuality. And that's why you develop basically intrinsically the best methods to engage the group and make them as enthusiastic about the content as you were. And I wonder where this could become a trap for a facilitator if can we be too engaged and too much in love with the content, because this might, air quotes, manipulate the group. And how would you deal with that?
I think that, yeah, there's a lot there. I would say that, I don't know about enthusiasm, but I would say that a lot of people, and I would say these people in my mind, like, aren't necessarily going to identify as facilitators, are entirely enthusiastic about the content and not about the group. And to me, that's what often distinguishes, or what I see as like a transition point for people who are like, yeah, I'm a presenter, I'm an educator, you know, like I do around this content, versus like I'm a facilitator and my content often is around these themes, or the work that I do is around these themes. So I think that there's a lot of people who are incredibly passionate about their content. They're really wanting people to leave with particular sets of information, and those people, I think, some can implement facilitation methods, but are often not approaching the experience as a facilitator. To me, as a facilitator, even in college, I believed that my first responsibility was to the group and the second responsibility was to the content. That like, if I promised that this space was a safe space for you to ask questions, which in social justice world, the word safe space is like kind of a controversial one, but just like if I told you, this is a place for you to ask questions, this is a place for you to get to be ignorant and have that met with like, yes, great, I'm so glad we get to get into this. If I tell you that, and then I don't actually create a space where that's true, you know, I roll my eyes at you, I allow other people to, without being like, hey, no, that's a legitimate question, you know, let's get into that, then I think that I'm shirking my responsibility to you. I'm like, and instead I might be prioritizing my excitement or responsibility or beliefs around the content, right? There are lots of times where I had to choose, like, I could just go straight into why you're wrong, but instead I actually need to like figure out how to connect to you, align with you, like, you know, get you and me on the same page before we can get into any of the content or the like material truth of your comment or your question, you know. And so, yeah, I think a lot of people are, it's not like over enthusiastic about the content, but it's more like who and what are you prioritizing in the moment, and is what you're doing and what you're saying you're going to do the same thing, right? Like if you said this is going to be a space for learning and exploration and growth, and what you're actually doing is like just throwing information at people, like, well, that's fine, but those maybe feel like different promises, right? And like if this space is like, we're going to do a lot of things together and we're going to get into deep conversations, we're going to unpack a lot of things, and then what happens is you end up giving people like 2 hours worth of content, that's going to feel really misaligned. And like, to me, I think of facilitation, or I think it might be useful sometimes to think of facilitation as like a medium, like a TED Talk is a medium, right? A book, a poem, a workshop, a facilitation, like those to me are all different types of mediums. And like, there's a message that there are things that books can do so brilliantly that a workshop cannot, right? And there's things that like a video, like, you know, lecture or a piece of art can do so brilliantly that like a workshop cannot. And I think there are things that workshops can do that none of those other mediums can do. And so I think that sometimes the disappointment or the like misalignment is that we're not using the workshop in the right we're not using the medium for what it's best at. And I think that we've probably all gone to sessions where you're like, oh, this person is an expert. I am so excited to like sit back and learn from them and just receive the wisdom. And they're like, turn to the person next to you. And you're like, no, like, you're like, no, just tell me the things. Like, I don't want you to facilitate me. You are the experts in the field. You are so knowledgeable. I am here for your wisdom. Like, give me that wisdom. You know, like I've gone to sessions like that in conferences, right? Where I'm like, you 4 people at the front of the room have 80 years of experience in this. Like, please don't facilitate me and this rando, you know, trying to figure out how to do this. That's not helpful unless it's going to help me get the information I came from, right? Like, so there are places for lectures. There are places for like, you don't want to call your plumber and be like, have them be like, well, where do you think the water turn off is? No, like that would be terrible. But when it comes to having a discussion, when it comes to unpacking truth that's already in the room, when it comes to unpacking, like, what do you really think about this and what's going unsaid? And you know, how does your socialization or your background, you know, influence how you unconsciously think about things? Like, those are the best times. Like, to me, those are things that facilitation as like a medium or a art or a methodology or whatever, like, that's what it's there for. That's what it's best at, is uncovering things that the group couldn't do without that container, and allowing like things to emerge that like where the group is greater than the sum of its, right? It's greater than the sum of its parts. To me, like, that's the times where I'm like, I'm just kicking it as a facilitator. Like, that is when I'm killing it, is because something happens that I couldn't have done by myself and they couldn't have done by themselves. It generated from beyond, right, as the collective. And to me, when we get too enamored with our content, it's because we're using we're going into a different place, you know, like we're maybe prioritizing a different type of medium and then calling it a workshop. And that's where the like delta of disappointment is, you know, where you show up for a workshop and what you got was a lecture, or you show up for a lecture and what you got was a workshop, you know, like those are really important differences.
And what you get is an email.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. I love that. And love the example with the plumber.
Yeah, I've used that example a lot, so it's a go-to.
And what I hear also from what you shared before, that there are different ways we can learn about facilitation. There is from doing, as you said, there are some things we just need to experience, experiment, do it over again, fail forward. Then there is, as you also shared, participating and then observing other facilitators and taking notes on these meta level. So how did they just do that? How is it that the group is now full on and asks all these questions, whereas another time nobody engaged?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a medium of a book, and you wrote a book yourself about facilitation. So what do you think is it about facilitation that we can learn from books? So when is a book a right medium to learn about facilitation? When is it experiencing someone else facilitating, so being a participant? And when is it to just go out there and give it a try?
Oh, that's such a good question. I don't know if I'll say before I give an answer is that this answer will be very extemporaneous, because I don't think that I have tried to categorize what you've just asked before. And yeah, I did co-write a book about facilitation. It's called Unlocking the Magic of Facilitation.
Which is awesome.
And yeah, and that book came out of, so you'll find this background a little bit interesting, and then we can go into your question. So that book came out of running workshops with my co-facilitator at the time, Sam Killerman, and my co-author. He and I ran a lot of train the trainers, and we would have essentially 2 days to teach people how to run a 3-hour gender and sexuality workshop, that after those 2 days, we were going to leave and they were going to do it. They were going to do it for their community or their company or their often college. And we would have 2 days with them. And so the second day we would get into kind of like concepts around facilitation. We would start really looking at the meta level and getting into those questions. And we always had so much more we wanted to give them, but we could never actually fit it into those 2 days. And so the book became the place where it was like, oh, we wanted to get into this topic, but we didn't. So here's the book, like we didn't get into neutrality, or we didn't get into vulnerability, or we didn't get into how to ask good questions. And so all of those are in the book, and you can find that. And in a training, we would have gotten into about half of it. So I would say that all of those concepts, the concepts that are in the book, there are 11 of them, and I won't recite them. I don't think I could off the top of my head, but the concepts that are in the book, I think, are all things that probably people have some baseline experience, like they have some entry place into, right? There's some level of familiarity or just like, oh yeah, I've experienced when somebody shared something vulnerable and it felt okay. And I've also experienced it where somebody has shared something vulnerable and it felt bad, like where, the facilitator leading the meeting like broke down and we all felt like, oh my gosh, we have to like rush over and like attend to their emotions. But I've had another one where a facilitator in a meeting was emotional, or like in a training was emotional, and it actually felt okay. I don't know what the difference was, and I could be like, well, in the chapter, you might get into the difference, right? And so I think that a lot of the concepts in there are things that people have some familiarity with: vulnerability, questions, being triggered or activated in a workshop. But you might not have broken down in detail. You might not have figured out like, what's the important difference between like, this is good vulnerability and this is too much, or like, this is a good question and these are ones that are going to actually probably end up backfiring. So I think you want some level of familiarity with it. And it's probably also something that like, I think books are really good when you have some sort of disagreement with the concept. If I was like, if you have some sort of disagreement with me, then you can read 15 pages about why I think the way I think, right? Versus if I'm just going to like tell you in a workshop, or I'm going to ask you to try something. If you have really strong disagreements with that, then we just might not be able to get into unpacking all of the different ways in which you disagree. So that's one thought I have, is some level of experience or familiarity with it. But I think that they're also concepts, right? Like they're not, at the end of it, I don't promise that you're going to feel confident doing things. Like I'm very much the person, can't remember who it came from, but there's some quote that really impacted me around like, confidence is what happens when you get things right again and again and again. Like before then you need courage. Like stop waiting for the confidence. You need courage at the beginning. Confidence comes from when people are like, you're brilliant at this. And they keep saying that. And you're like, okay, I feel confident. But like before that, you just need courage. And so like, I think when it comes to, if you're nervous about, like, I'm nervous about, leading a Q&A with people asking questions I've never gotten before. I could be like, well, here's a bunch of structures and ways to run a really good Q&A to set yourself up for success. I could send that to you in a blog or an article or a book. But for you to be like, I feel good going in, I feel prepared going in, that's great. You can maybe prepare somebody, but you can't, they're going to have to do it in order for them to like embody that learning. So I think you can help someone prepare and prep and feel more ready going in, but I don't think you can ever make someone feel ready without the trying it. Like that's when they actually, when the rubber hits the road, that's when they're gonna be able to enter a new place of embodied understanding or internalized understanding.
Also, I guess to find their own words to be this authentic person, inviting the participants to join them in an experience, because I think it's like with teaching. My supervisor always said that he only teaches a course 3 times because after the 3rd time he doesn't learn anything anymore. So every time we're teaching, we're rephrasing a concept, we embody or we learn it better for ourselves. And I think to read about a concept in a textbook and then to do it will feel kind of odd the first time you try it because it's not yours yet. Yeah.
I also think that like facilitation is so abstract to most people who aren't facilitation geeks or who don't think of facilitation in the ways that we might, that they don't really know. Like somebody asked me recently, like, do you have any resources on facilitation? And I was like, yes, but what do you want to learn? And they were like, just anything. And I was like, oh, I don't, okay, well, I don't know if I have the resource for that person who's like, I want to learn anything about facilitation, because it might be like, well, which of these 15 concepts makes you feel anxious or curious or interested, right? Like, do you want to get better at asking questions? Do you want to get better at the first 5 minutes? Do you want to get better at like feeling empowered to cut people off? Like, what is, I think that new facilitators might not, they don't know what questions to ask in order to get better. And I feel like a lot of that sort of stuff you can deliver asynchronously via like text, right? You can do on a blog or a podcast, or not a podcast would be different, but you could get into that conversation. But that sort of stuff, I think you can start in that kind of asynchronous medium of a book. It's just like, here's some things you might not even realize you need to consider, or that would be useful or empowering to consider. But then when it comes to the more detailed questions or the like, how do I do that but stay authentic to me? I think that's probably the stuff that would be much more like, vital and robust in person.
Do you believe in facilitation certification?
I don't know if so to me, certification, like I'll clarify that first. To me, certification means like a standard that like that standard is published somewhere. That standard is kept up, as in like if your certification expires, you have to go back and get another one. You don't just get it one time and you're good to go forever. Like when I think of the certifications I've gotten in my life around like first aid responsiveness or like wilderness medicine, like that was something that expired after a number of years because we didn't expect you to keep that knowledge in your head forever, right? And there are people whose jobs, they have to go to CPR training every 2 years for the rest of their life, and those to me are like certifications that I feel really good about calling a certification. I think that a lot of people call a course a certification because they want to increase its apparent value. Like they're like, oh, we certify, I ran a thing for a long time where people asked us, do you certify safe zone facilitators? Safe zone is the gender and sexuality training that I did. And I was like, no, because we're not going to make you come back. Like we're not going to make you come back. We're not going to upkeep. We're not going to evaluate you. There's no final test. There's no way for me to know any of those things, like other than you went through the course. And so we offered what we called a certificate of completion, which was basically like, you made it to the end. That's it. That's all we know you did, because that's all we know you did. And if someone's building out a facilitation certification, like I would say, if they were like, yeah, this is how I evaluate people, this is how I know, their skill sets or abilities, this is what I'm certifying them as, this is how often they have to re-up, like all of those things, I don't know if I would personally be like, ugh, don't do it, I think that's just like a skeezy business model. Like, I don't think that, but I do think calling things certifications that have none of those qualities, I don't agree with that. I'm not here for that. I am here for people wanting to like professionally skill up and wanting to get better at their craft and having a place to do that and having a way to demonstrate and if they are able to demonstrate that to people and they want to be able to do that with a word, like that could be cool. What's interesting though is I think most of the people who would be looking at that certification would have no context for it. Like most of the clients who would be seeing that on your resume would have no idea what that was. Professional facilitators aren't usually hired by professional facilitators. They're hired by completely non-professional facilitators. So unlike where you see, oh, Meg has a CPR first aid certification, I have a vague idea of what that means. The layperson isn't going to know what any of the certification means. And I think that makes it, I think that just, it makes it very different than a lot of other things.
It's a very good point. On the one hand, I always feel that all the facilitators, at the end of the day, we're doing the same stuff. Right? We're using the same method, the same tools, but the way we use them is totally different.
Sure.
Because everyone comes from a different background, everyone frames them slightly differently or puts them in a different order. And then what at the end are you, certifying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's a good question, or I think it's a question for people, but I also know like some people really like having specific trainings that they're going to, that they're, aspiring to, that they feel like are really leveling up their professional skills, and they want that to feel official, and I think the word certification does that. It's utility, like with wilderness first responder certifications, that means the person hiring you knows you've received this training, right? And that's really useful for them to know, and it's really useful for you to be able to display. And that's my, reference point. But with facilitation, like I doubt the people who are hiring you, unless they're looking for a particular, they're like, I know you've got this background, I know you have this certification, and that's a way for me to filter the 500 people who applied to this program, is like, I want to know that you went through this. Then, wow, that's great utility. But I just think that's uncommon.
Also, because I was just thinking, if you have a first aid certification, then basically you're delivering the promise that you would know what to do to save someone's life.
Or properly bandage their leg. Yeah. Yeah.
To some extent. And it's very difficult to promise certain outcomes or results when we're dealing with group dynamics.
Yeah. I'm curious, like, for you, does this feel like a really important thing for the field of professional facilitators to like talk about or agree upon, the certification thing?
I realized that there are different camps of facilitators, and some who really believe in having and developing an international standard, because now everyone can call themselves facilitator, and
sure.
there are all kinds of facilitators out there. And I think that or a bad workshop can really have collateral damage. So sure. I remember when I started off as a facilitator, I started the podcast basically because the answer I would get from people is, what? Facilitator? Oh, workshops. People still do that? Because workshops had such a bad reputation, at least in the environment where I tried to pitch myself. So on the one hand, I understand that it might be beneficial for the profession in general to have some quality standards. On the other hand, so I don't have any certification whatsoever in the field of facilitation, and still would consider myself as a professional facilitator doing a good job. So I haven't made up my decision, but I think it's I'm curious about the different answers, and I was especially curious about yours.
Yeah, I think that I think that it makes sense to want to have a bar or to be able to regulate in some way, I guess, like who uses a term to do what. And I guess if you have a certification, then you say like, I am a blank, blank, blank type of facilitator, right? And it means something specifically. But I think I definitely don't think we can stop people from using the word facilitator who aren't good facilitators, let alone people who just aren't facilitating. You know, I don't know how many times I've been in a session where people are like, I'm your facilitator for today, and then they're lecturing, and I'm like, like, no, you know, like I think that's different. So I have no illusion that I'm going to control that. And that for me, part of my job when I am hired as a facilitator is to make it very clear what I mean when I say that, right? Or what you're hiring me for, or what the expectations of like what a session with me looks like. I think that's on me. And like, yeah, as somebody who worked in social justice for a long time, like there was nobody coming in clean to my workshops who weren't bringing baggage of past experiences around workshops or trainings or just material related to the topic. Everybody had that. And I think there's no certification that could have prevented that. There's just, like there's nothing I could have prevented that. I just needed to know that I was working with that truth, that no one was coming in with a clean slate. And just like, I'm here to experience what you are doing. None of us are probably ever going to be somebody's first meeting or first training. That's a pretty rare thing. So yeah, we have to work with what's already true.
Which is a nice concept because there's so much to learn from that, from the good experiences and the bad experiences that everyone brings into the space.
Yeah. I had a facilitator tell me one time that they started a lot of their trainings with how can we make this experience miserable? Like, how can we just like guarantee this meeting sucks? And no one, yeah, it's so good. Like, I love opposite thinking. It's way more fun than like, how can we make sure this goes really well? Like, no one is amped to answer that question, but like, how do we destroy this meeting is a fun question or an energizing question to start with. Until we all start doing it, and then everyone's like, oh, this question again. Like, you can make anything tired, but everyone's got opinions on that because everyone's been to a meeting before, right? Like, you're not starting from a clean slate. Or even to a training, maybe not with these colleagues, or like maybe not in this setting, but yeah, I think that we're never starting from square one, and so that's just something we have to know about. We have to know how to set people up for success with us.
Yeah. Just one comment, because this opposite thinking, this pre-mortem is just my favorite one, because I think that our brain is just wired in a way that we can better respond to these kind of problems. We are risk averse. We see potential death everywhere. So if we are asked for, okay, how can we make this successful? We are so lazy that we only think of our past successes and try to replicate that. But if someone is threatening our life, we get fucking creative in finding ways to avoid that. Yeah. So it just brings nice energy into it.
Yeah.
How would you distinguish a good facilitator from a bad facilitator?
Great question. So when I was in college, there were some people who were like, I'm really interested in running safe zone trainings and doing these gender and sexuality workshops. And these were other queer people, I'm queer, other queer people who were like interested in taking this over. And there were one of two of them where I was like, you don't like people that much. Like, and you particularly don't like ignorant straight people when they're interacting, especially around gender and sexuality stuff. Like, you won't like most of the people in your workshop, and not just like you won't like, but it's going to take a lot of work for you to be able to like empathize, connect, to not just align with them, but to tolerate them. Like you have a pretty low tolerance for them. And so I was like, I don't think you should do it. Like I don't think you should do that. I think that, and it's not to say that you have to like your participants or that you have to like identify with them. You don't. And it's not to say you can't dislike them. That's fine. Like there's a lot of people I've had in workshops where I'm not a fan, I don't want to spend another 2 hours together, but I have to, I think, have at least a baseline tolerance for your participants and at best, like a reasonable level of like acceptance of like, people are going to show up in lots of different ways and that is okay. I am here for that. I am like willing to not find or be thrown by that. Or if I'm thrown, I'm committed to coming back, right? But like, I am willing to show up for everyone who is going to show up in this workshop. There is no one who I will roll my eyes at and just allow myself to just dismiss. To me, when I see facilitators do that, where they're like, I'm not here for half this group, I'm like, oh, like to me, I want to see people be there for the group, right? And that's not to say like you can't be like, you know what, this participant's not showing up in a way that I can actually work with, and I'm just gonna like let them go physically out of the room or the Zoom, or emotionally, I'm gonna stop paying attention to them and stop like giving them my emotional energy. That's a smart facilitation move, right? That's a necessary thing to do sometimes, but I don't think you should I don't think that should happen right off the bat. So to me, like, bad facilitator, I'm bad at critiquing people, but like I would say that's not a good role for you, right? In social justice movements, which is where I come from a lot of times, like there are lots of different roles people can occupy, right? There are the people who are like, I'm going to shut down the bridge because no one's paying attention to this problem, right? There are the people who sit in trees and protest logging, and those people have a particular type of like, they might have a particular type of energy or passion or skill set or abilities, or just like, I don't know, intrinsic personality that makes them like, I don't mind standing in front of, or like, I am willing to stand in front of traffic. That's the type of like energy that I'm bringing to this movement. And I'm going to force people to sit down at the table with us. And then there are other people who I think have a predisposition towards like, hey, thanks so much for coming to this table. Super great to see you. Let's have a conversation about this, right? And those people, I think, have like a propensity or a possibility of around like this facilitation space. And I think a bad facilitator is somebody who doesn't want to be a facilitator. Like they want to be doing something else, right? They're like, I'm here to make sure you leave with exactly this content in your brain. I'd be like, okay, that might be exactly a perfect thing for you to be, but it's not a facilitator, right? And so I think it's when people are, a bad facilitator is somebody who doesn't want to facilitate and who wants to do other things that may be equally important. But again, it's back to that medium place. Oh, it took me a minute to get there, but that's what I believe. A bad facilitator is somebody who doesn't want to facilitate. They don't want to do that. They don't want to be there for the group. And they're not really open to the possibility of what could happen. They're there with their own conclusion, ready to go. And they're like, this is exactly where we're going to go today. And I'm not really open to a lot of possibilities. I'd be like, yeah, you could be a brilliant, I don't know, something else like educator, host, storyteller. There's lots of things you could be brilliant at. I'm just not sure you would be a brilliant facilitator, or I would think of that as a brilliant facilitator.
And I wonder, from what you said, what is the level of self-awareness and what is pure character? Because I can imagine that also the example you gave, someone stepping into the room and say, I want to be the facilitator, where you say, maybe not so much. So yeah. Is it then a lack of self-awareness? And is this something that we can train to become better at in order? Because I think where it often goes wrong is that we get triggered by the group or individuals in the group, and that they would say something that makes us emotional.
Absolutely.
And I think in order to then become a good facilitator is also to just be aware of our trigger points. Where do you draw the line?
I think that, so I think that triggers is something, you don't have to be immune to them to be a good facilitator. I do think you have to have a commitment to navigating them. This is something that I used to teach specifically, or I do teach specifically. But to me, when I'm a facilitator, I have a disproportionate responsibility to the group compared to the other people in the room, right? Like if you are a regular participant and you go off at me, like, and you just like fly off the handle, that's one thing, right? Like not ideal, but it's like, that's one thing. If I do that as a facilitator, I think that is exponentially worse, right? Than any participant doing that. So I see facilitators as having a disproportionate responsibility to the people in the room, even if they don't have necessarily a disproportionate amount of, yeah, we usually have a little more control, right? We might give it over and be like, here you go, group, you are leading this, you know, like this is really your conversation and I'm really not going to be the main participant in it. And I think that's beautiful, but we do, I think, have a disproportionate responsibility. And so I think we have to have a commitment to navigating our own triggers when we are in a group. Whether that means we can do it the first time they show up is a totally different thing, right? But if somebody was like, that's on my participant to not trigger me, that's where I disagree. I'd be like, no, it's not on your participant to not trigger you. It would be ideal, right? Like it would be great if people didn't say things that triggered you or did things that triggered you. That would be awesome. But that's not actually their responsibility, because you are stepping into this unique space and unique leadership role of like, I am here for the group. We, I think, have a unique responsibility to navigate our triggers. And so if somebody was like, yeah, I'm not going to do that, I'd be like, I think I disagree. I think you need to. I think you have to have a commitment to identifying your triggers, getting better at them, learning new strategies for them. And it's okay if like we all need permission to fail sometimes, or just like to know that if we did fail, that's normal, right? Like I would not be standing here if I couldn't have done bad workshops, because you can't get better, right? Like everyone wants a therapist with 20 years experience, but you have to have the first 20 years to get there, you know? So you want a facilitator who's really good at their job, but like you have to be bad at your job sometimes to get there. But yeah, I would say the self-awareness piece, it can be taught. You can teach somebody how to pay attention to themselves when they're triggered. You can give your participants an opportunity to give you the feedback of like, this really wasn't okay. Or your co-facilitator, this really wasn't, like what happened there, like that was you being triggered. That wasn't you showing up for the group. And I think, so it doesn't have to rest all on you. You can invite that outside perspective. But I think that's really important. And I would say, I think that's an essential part of being a facilitator, is that like, if you're taking responsibility for the group, then you have to kind of own that level of responsibility. The other piece though, that you asked around like personality versus training, like, I think that, I think I want to be very clear that I think there's lots of different personality types that are good facilitators. There are those people who are like quiet and you kind of have to lean in to hear them. And when they say something, everyone pays attention because they're like, oh, that person's talking. I am not that person. Like I am loud. I am, you know, I will shout. I'll do like little games to get back your attention. Like that's not going to be my energy. And I love those people. I think those people are really fantastic, right? And I think we do ourselves a huge disservice when we think all facilitators needs to be outgoing, extroverted, bombastic, charismatic people. Like I have seen an incredibly uncharismatic person lead some really powerful stuff. Like, and it was just because the forms they were using, the structures of their activities, the invitations and the way they set it up was fantastic. They were not charismatic, like almost to a point of it being like distracting, like where you were like, how do you do that being just such a not people person? But yeah, so I think you can be a facilitator with a ton of different personalities. But I do think that some people have a propensity that is helpful. You know, they tend to be curious, or they tend to be introspective about the group, or they really care about what motivates different types of people, or they're interested in those things. I think all of those kind of propensities really help. And then to me, it's also just about like fit and want. Do you want to be able to do what a facilitation will allow you to do or unlock? Or are you resentful of being forced into that role? I think it's harder to get good at things we resent having to do, because there's no like intrinsic motivation to get better at them. So the people in my life who have been kind of forced into educator roles, and then I'm like, you're not very good at this. And they're like, I don't want to be good at this. And I'm like, well, that's a good reason to be bad at it. You know, like you don't have your own self-motivation. So I think oftentimes when I see people who aren't good facilitators, it's because they don't want to be. They don't want to be, or they're just not having the structures and the support system to like help them get better. And then you could tip into the like egotistical places where people are like, I'm brilliant, and we're like, you're not. And that's maybe a whole other category, right? If people were like, I'm a great facilitator, I know I'm a great facilitator, and I don't do feedback forms anymore because like I know I'm brilliant. That's like another camp altogether, but I don't run into that as much.
Thank you. You mentioned that this first phase of needing the bad experiences in order to learn from it and grow. For you, what makes a bad workshop, or what makes a workshop fail?
I mean, there's so many things. And I listened to your most recent guest who talked about how like sometimes like the bad experience might have been necessary for like maybe that was part of their journey. Maybe that was what needed to happen. Yeah, loved that podcast. It was such a good episode. And so I would say like what makes a bad workshop for me might be different than what makes a bad workshop for other people. I leave feeling distraught after a workshop when there's probably like a couple of characteristics for me that continuously pop up. And I imagine I would be actually really curious to know for you, like what are those for you? I would say mine are when I took over and I didn't facilitate. I talked too much. I like got excited about what somebody said and cut in too early. When I made it about me. That I think is when I feel really distraught after workshops. I'm like, like I made it about me when that didn't serve the group, when that really was about me and it wasn't about them. And that makes me really sad. And it makes me feel like that workshop is really bad. When there's a huge misalignment between the activities or the structures that I've picked and like where the group is at, when it's just like, I thought that this was going to work and it really didn't. Like people just never bought in. That's a terrible workshop for me. Is people like the whole time you can tell you just don't have the group. You don't have their trust. You don't have their buy-in, their participation. There's a graph that I have taught about facilitation versus teaching versus lecturing. And to me, there are two things that really distinguish those things. One is active participation and one is agency over the information being shared. And for facilitation, your participants have to participate. Like that's something I believe is that like you cannot facilitate without active participation from your participants, and not just some, but quite a bit. Like I often say, like I ask a lot of my participants in my workshops. And so a bad facilitation is when like we can't hang out in that quadrant or that corner because they weren't willing to give me their active participation, and they weren't willing to like kind of take control in that way. And I feel really disappointed because that's usually where I want to hang out. And I don't personally, I usually don't blame them. I'm not like, oh, I had a tough group today. I'm like, I didn't figure out how to crack the group. I didn't figure out how to bring what they needed in order to participate, because there are groups that were super resistant to the workshop that I was doing and left being like, this was amazing, and there were other times where people were like, I'm excited, and left feeling crap, so to me, I see myself as usually the difference maker in those cases. And to me, a bad workshop is when it doesn't do, I wasn't able to bring the group on the journey for some reason.
Very interesting. And I cannot not ask the question, would it change if you, if you switch the perspective? So what would you consider a bad workshop from the perspective of a participant?
Oh, great question. I think one that feels fake, like one that feels like fake and arbitrary, and and where people are saying things that you're like, that's not true, but they're not allowing you any space to say, hey, that's not true, you know. I like, and I know I've done this because I speak for, like, I have a bad habit of saying people when I mean like a really small subset of people. And I think that that is like, yeah, I think that that can be such an irritation when people are, yeah, that's such a specific example, but I think it happens a lot in workshops where people are generalizing and making kind of universal claims, and they're giving people no opportunity to check that or to get a word in. So I think like workshops that feel fake, that feel disconnected. And then what else from a participant's perspective? Where you were asked to go far too deep, far too, to be vulnerable when it wasn't safe, to reveal things that then weren't utilized in ways that were meaningful. Like, or when you were asked to do a bunch of things that were arbitrary, when you were like, like, we talked about this and then you didn't even ask us, or like, that didn't go anywhere. You know, like, I think a bad workshop is when we waste people's time. And, or a bad facilitation is when people feel like their time was wasted. And I think that can happen in so many different ways that we can waste people's time. Whether that's like, I didn't need to be there, they didn't involve me at all, or while I was there, I actually went really deep and that didn't feel honored, that didn't feel used. Or people ask big questions and then they, 2 minutes later, I was asked to stop. Like, I went to a real place and then they pulled me back. There's so many different ways we can feel disrespected in those ways. And I think that's what a bad workshop is when people feel, yeah, when they feel disrespected or their time was wasted. Or they were duped. That's the last one I want to say. Like when you sign up for a workshop and you're like, you're going to get blank. And then people are like, actually, I'm just going to advertise my new course at you. And you're like, no, I'm here for information. Like, I'm not here for an hour-long advertisement, And so I think we have a responsibility to be really transparent with people about like, what are they going to get out of it? And yeah, I had a participant do that where they were like, I don't feel like you advertised this appropriately. I feel like this ended up being an hour-long advertisement, and I left because I felt like it was a waste of my time. And I was like, I'm so sorry. Like, we didn't advertise it properly or facilitate it properly, if that's what it felt like. So yeah, I think that's when our time is wasted.
What have you learned from this experience?
What did I learn from that one? I learned a lot of things. I learned to try to be more specific about the how much detail I was giving people around what to expect. If I was, and I do a lot of workshops where I use a decent amount of technology in my facilitation, like business or practice, either on the back end or when I'm actually working with people. And so there's a lot of times where it took me a long time to learn how to use Mural or how to use Airtable or how to use Gather, and I just want to share that information with people. And so I run sessions where I'm introducing people to a new technology. And for me, that's very much from like I'm so excited to share this technology with you. It's really, really cool place, but it can end up feeling like an advertisement for the company, which is like worst case scenario. I'm not getting paid for it from the company, and I'm just disappointing people who are attending. So a couple of things for that, like we've learned to talk about the problems, like, and bring those up. Like, here's the things it doesn't do. Here's the things it does really poorly or what we wish was different. And also to just spend a little less time on the features and more time experiencing and like building out things and letting people like experiment and learn the features more slowly. That's like really specific, but yeah, that's what I learned from that session.
Yeah, and I think it's especially when it comes to online facilitation and when it comes to playing around or even teaching new tools, I think this is very tricky to really keep the balance between making it a group experience instead of just recording a YouTube video and say, okay, I guide you through and then learn it yourself. And to make this kind of a group learning experience, given the different levels of technological understanding, and then random challenges like bandwidth.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that it's also about being really like sometimes people feel this temptation to like share an entire agenda, like here's our agenda, here's all the activities we're going to do. And I think I've had that temptation, and I think it's a bad one. When you're a facilitator and you want to go with the group and the flow of the group, it like ties you to something way too structured. But I do think that I've gotten better at being like, in the first hour, we're going to do these two things. We're going to explore the technology, and we're going to try one like building out thing. And in the second hour, that's going to be way more open-ended now that we all have this information together. And just being able to tell people like, this is going to be, a guided build process that probably could be live streamed. And it's really not so much a facilitation, where we're just going to ask a bunch of questions or be as open-ended, and just giving people that right amount of framing, I think is really helpful.
And I think the same applies actually for communicating to our groups about the agenda.
Yeah.
If we're too narrow, then there might be some who either complain in advance, say, I don't like that, I don't agree that maybe we should spend more time on this and that, and less time.
Yeah.
So they start to kind of advise you. And yeah, as you said, it doesn't leave enough room for nimble facilitation if the group turns out to need something different, actually.
Yeah.
But if you keep it too broad, then there are those who like to at least mentally prepare for the session who will feel lost.
Yeah. And I think the worst is when you advertise something you don't do, right? In either direction, like, or promise something that you can't meet. Like, I think it's better to say nothing than to promise something and not meet it, because then you've created expectation, right? So
childhood trauma coming up.
Hopefully not. But yeah, possibly.
So what kind of tools do you rely on when you prepare for a workshop? Where do you find inspiration? How do you get your agenda together?
Well, this is going to sound really cheesy, but I use Facilitator Cards, which is the tool that I helped develop last year, and that I do as a business. Like, I really do use them every time I run a workshop, and that's why they are a thing, is because I kept using them. So a little bit of backstory. A number of years ago, I was running a training with Sam, who's the co-author of that book and who was the co-founder of Facilitator Cards. And we realized about a week out that this training was not going to be the training we thought it was going to be. We thought we were going to go in there and do a regular train the trainer. And we had a call, a week out with them. And we were like, oh, that's not what's about to happen. Like, we're not doing a normal train the trainer. This is a very different thing. And we can't be like, hey, we're completely unprepared. Can you give us like a bunch of time between now and next week to like tell us all the information we need in order to make this workshop? Like, that wasn't possible. And so we couldn't prepare an agenda at the level of detail that we were used to. And so what we did was we wrote down every structure, every activity framework that we knew. We were like, okay, pair share, mind mapping, go around the circle, make a list, pro con, 5 whys. Okay, and we wrote all of those things down on index cards. And that's our agenda. We had the first 90 minutes planned on the agenda in index cards. We were like, we are going to do, we were going to have them like do mind mapping of like what, this was a train the trainer, right? So like, what is facilitation? What are all the things you want to learn about facilitation? We did mind map. We had them pick 10 of those things and put them up on the board as sticky notes. We did some dot voting or we did grouping, and then we did some dot voting to figure out where to focus. And that was the first 90 minutes, and that's as far as we had gotten. And then we were like, okay, time for a 15-minute break. And we like ran to the back, took our index cards, and we're like, what's the next 90 minutes? And that's how we had a bunch of information from our group. We knew the skills and the different understandings and awarenesses and problems they were having. And so that's how we built the whole training. We did it 90 minutes at a time using these index cards that had these different structures on them. And we were like, okay, these are the ones we've already used. How can we do this differently? How can we get into this conversation in a new way? And those index cards, and we did it. We facilitated a 2-day training, building 90 minutes at a time.
Awesome. Love
because
that.
we didn't have to rely on our brains to think about how do we facilitate, right? We had all of our hows. We just needed to figure out like what, when, and then we just plugged the correct how into the correct moment. We were like, oh, that would be good to do as like a roundtable a fishbowl discussion. And this one will be good to do as like a self-reflection 5 whys, and then to move into like a pair share, and then we'll do a full group debrief, right? Like we could take things and put them in those categories. So those index cards became facilitator cards, which is like now a deck of 60 processing tools that you can use anytime you're planning or training a workshop. And they're color coded, like way better than the index cards. They're color coded into like different categories, and they're organized. They have the props you need to facilitate them. And they have like a little place for you to like write on the cards your notes so that you know what you're using it for. And that's what I do every time I facilitate. So like I have 2 agendas to write this week. The first thing that I do is I take out the deck and I flip through them, and I just go, yes, no, yes, yes. Like, and I just make a pile of like, here are possible things I could do with this group, and then I often think about what are the goals that I have, what's the time constraint, all of those. Are we doing everything in the large group? How can I get some small group and some like self-reflection in there? And then I pick, the 10 facilitator cards that I'm going to use, or the 6 facilitator cards that I'm going to use to help me kind of create that agenda. And it helps me feel like, I think as a facilitator, it's really hard to feel confident going into something when you are as open to possibility as a lot of us want to be, right? We want to go in and be like, I am like, we have that phrase, like open to outcome. I'm here for the group. I want to be flexible and responsive. And that's awesome and beautiful, but it also is like a really high bar to like set for yourself, right? And like a lot to hold. And if you're online, it's even more, because there's so much less like in the moment, things you can do. So for me, having facilitator cards, having my agenda laid out on them rather than a Google Doc, first of all, I can only write so much because they're the size of a playing card, right? And so because of that, I actually look at them, because they're the what I've written on them is small enough, versus like you'll have your whole Google agenda and then, or like your whole doc, open. And I never looked at them because I never had time to scan the 5, paragraphs that I had written during a meeting. So I always have them in front of me, and it makes me feel like, okay, there's going to be interaction, there's going to be engagement. I know what structures I'm going to use, but I also always have a pile of backups of things that I'm like, I know that I can do these without any extra technology or supplies if you're in person. And I've already got a couple of questions written on them of like, if we run out of time, like, well, if we have too much, if we don't have enough to do, here are 5 things we could do. Or if it's not working.
Did this ever happen?
If we have enough time. More like if something isn't working, this is the place we can go.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes with online workshops, I'm a little less good at the time. And I'll be like, this is going to take us 25 minutes to get everyone over there, trying this out, like learning it, and we'll be done in 10. And I'm like, oh, okay, cool. We actually do have more time. But that's because I time box pretty generously. So yeah, it does happen, but only because my agendas have gotten shorter in the first place. So those are the things I do to prepare for a workshop. And at this point, I collect new, like if somebody does something and I'm like, oh, I've never seen that before, that's such a cool like structure. I basically sock it away as a facilitator card. Like there are blank cards. And so I'll write, oh, that's really cool. Like one, liberating structures, or even just like something I pulled from a YouTube video last week. They did I want you to predict what's going to be true a week from now. And I was like, oh, that's a really cool idea, because I'm a facilitation geek. So I was like, I could use that as a facilitator card. And I was like, I called it Predict the Future. And I was like, okay, participants, like this was a training to get you to be more facilitator, like to do more facilitations. Like, tell me in a month, what do you think is actually going to happen? Like, are you going to have done anything? Not aspirational, but like, tell me with certainty what is going to happen. And someone was like, I'm going to talk about it. I don't think I'll do anything, but I'm going to be like, remember when Meg said blank, or remember when this came up? I think that's what I predict. I'm going to have talked about it and not done anything. And I was like, cool. So like now I think of those new structures as as like facilitator cards, and I write them down. So I have more things if I need to pull.
Awesome. Do you have a favorite exercise?
We talked about one already, which was opposite thinking, which is just like flip whatever you're talking about with the group, like how to be a brilliant facilitator, ask them how to be a terrible one, right? If you want to talk about how to run a brilliant workshop, ask them how to run a terrible one. Like that's one of my favorites, opposite thinking. I think the most underrated one is probably minute papers. Just give people a minute to think by themselves before you do anything else. Like so underutilized, and I think it's really powerful. And let me see, I'm flipping through them right now.
Are you flipping through your facilitation cards? Yay.
Yeah. So we've talked about this a little bit, we've talked about Q&As a lot. And so I'll just give you one. That's one of my favorites for Q&As. So when I used to do gender and sexuality workshops and more social justice workshops, we use this structure, we call it frequently asked questions. And I would write up a list of like 6 to 8 questions that I was like, I know you have these questions. I've done this content enough to know that this is where you're stuck, right? Or these are the questions you're afraid to ask. It's really good for things like you're afraid to ask, because you just put the list up, numbered list 1 through 8. And all you have to do is say, can someone just call out a number that they would like to have answered? And somebody's like, number 4. And you're like, okay, number 4. And then you read out the question and then you answer it. And I did that the first time when I was like doing I don't do a lot of speaking engagements, but I was doing a lecture, and we wanted to get audience questions at the end. We knew we couldn't collect them or sort them. It was way too fast. And we also knew that most people didn't want to say things. They didn't actually want to articulate the questions. They did not want but it was around trans issues. So it was like, what, does everybody get surgery? Like people don't want to put that in their mouth and then say it out loud, but they want to know the answer. And so by like putting numbers next to them, all they had to say was number 4. And then we could read it out. Yeah.
Taking away the shame and the burden. It's just,
And like, that's for them, right? That's all for them. But for you, it's, you have complete control over what questions you're willing to answer, right? You're giving, like, it's not the illusion of agency, but more like they might feel like, oh, wow, we really got to pick. And you're like, but so did I, right? Like I got to control the questions that got answered. And then you can also start practicing, and you can practice the questions ahead of time, right? Like you could actually prepare your answers to them but have it not feel scripted. Because in the sense that there's still a level of control and agency from your participants. So yeah, that's frequently asked questions. And I love that one. It's really good. You can do it online really easily with just like a screen share, but you can also do it. It's like one of the only structures that probably works just as well in like a TED Talk lecture format as I think it does in a 3-day, workshop.
Good one.
Yeah.
What is it that you would have liked to know before? So if you would now talk to your younger self, being a beginner facilitator, what would you tell yourself?
I think something that I'm grateful I've gotten over is believing that this is my only chance. When I used to do workshops and trainings in college, I really believed like this has to go well, because if it doesn't go well, I'm like letting down the queer community. I'm like allowing this person to continue just having all these messed up thoughts in their head, or not challenge the socialization that they grew up with. And that pressure to like get it right now and to see that change right now was really tough, like really tough to sit with, because I felt crushed when I didn't nail it, right? When I felt like, man, I left a lot of possibility on the table, or that people really didn't get there, or this was a bad one, like this group never bought in. I felt really crushed by that, because I felt like I'm never going to get another chance with that group. And the truth is I didn't, right? I wasn't going to get another chance. But I also stopped, my earlier self believed like kind of egotistically, like that, I was like the fork in the road, you know, and I failed. And that was going to be a really big problem versus like, I was just one of many opportunities for them to get this information or to have this understanding or to have this experience. And so, yeah, I think I would want to tell my younger self something to the effect of like, you are part of their journey, like you are not their journey. And you are like, when you have a bad day, that can be really disappointing for everybody. And that doesn't mean you've failed, you know, like for me, like you have failed your movement, you failed your people, you have failed the content, you know, like a lot of us have content we think is incredibly valuable or even invaluable to our participants. And that feeling of failure to it was really hard. And I think it's more like, this is part of the journey, not the entirety of it. And also like, you don't necessarily need to see the change in order for the change to be there. The image that I like, if you walk towards a light switch in the dark, like you're not going to know you're moving, like if somebody else is doing that, right? Imagine somebody is moving towards a light switch, until they flick it and lights go on in the house, like you're not going to know that they've actually made progress towards it. But they have, like, right, there's a lot of movement that can happen before the moment of like kind of externalized change occurs. And so I think that as facilitators, it's sometimes really hard when you feel like I didn't move those people at all. Like they were not moved by each other. I didn't create the possibility for them to really advance. And I try to keep that image of like, you can, like maybe there was a lot of movement towards that light switch. It just hasn't gone on yet, right? And sometimes it goes on and that's amazing when we can see it in the moment, but there's a lot of movement that can happen before the lights go on.
And just because you cannot feel it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. So there are also some people who just don't articulate it.
Totally.
And sometimes it just takes time. But yeah, the responsibility, feeling responsibility, I think that's also one of my biggest learnings, that I'm not responsible for the experience of someone in the group, and I'm not responsible of them generating great ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I
That's
love that for facilitation, that like facilitation means to make easy, right? I think that sometimes, I don't know, maybe it's too much to say, like, sometimes I think we think it's like to make possible, like, or that you're just going to like, it's going to be inherently able to happen because you're there, versus like you're turning the difficulty dial down, right? You're allowing them to play the game on easy mode instead of on expert mode for a time being, but that still requires them to play, right? They still have to be active participants in that process. And if somebody's like, I'm not playing this game today, doesn't matter how easy the mode is, they're not going to be cruising through it, you know?
Yeah, there's this saying that you can lead a horse to the water hole, but it still needs to drink itself.
Yeah. I mean, if there's one more thing I could mention about my earlier self, it's that, and this is something I just see debilitating a lot of people, is like, you cannot change somebody's mind. They get to change their mind. You can make it possible for them to change, but like, you can't go in there and like turn that dial, right? Like, and they have agency over themselves. Like, they are able to do that. There are consequences for them not doing that. There is the sadness or grief that comes with not being able to do that. I spoke with somebody recently who their staff member won't get vaccinated, and they work in schools in the US, and the schools they are going into now have a requirement of anybody who's going into this school has to be vaccinated. And they were like, oh, I just can't convince them to get vaccinated. And I was like, you probably have already done more than you can do to like encourage that, but you can't actually force them to. Like, you have to give back that control. Like, you have to let go of the illusion of control that you can. And you might need to shift into, my advice was like, I think you might need to shift into the grief of letting that employee go, because this is a long-standing relationship. You're really sad about it. And that illusion of control, like, I can make them do this. I was like, but you know you can't. And they know you can't. Like, and you have to just say, I'm really sad. Like, or rather, I think what's left to say is, I'm really sad that our working relationship is coming to an end, because I want that not to be true, but you have agency over yourself and whether you get vaccinated. And I'm more than willing to support you, but I probably have already pushed too hard, right? And give them back that knowledge that, like, you are in control of your life, but there are consequences, which is like, for that person, like, it means they can't be employed any longer because the schools won't allow them in. So yeah, I think that, like, there's so many times where there's this power struggle of, like, you have to change. And I know for me, when I feel that way, it's because it's so, the change I want to see is so important, right? It's so important. It's so, it alleviates a lot of unnecessary suffering, right? And that's the ones that are rage filling. Like, I loved what your guest said about, like, rage is collective grief. And I was just like, oh yeah. And I just think anyone who's got that, yeah, like, who experiences this world as, like, too full of unnecessary suffering, knows how exhausting it is to try to force change that is so important. But the knowing that, like, you can just make it easier. Like, you have to make it easier for them to change, but ultimately they are the person that controls that. And that, I think, was also really forgiving of my younger self, or that was something I really needed to lean into, was like, I can only make it so possible for you to be vulnerable, or, to believe this, or to take this new perspective. Like, I can make that as easy as possible, but ultimately, like, you still have agency and control. And every time I disagree with that, you get defensive, and that's, actually doesn't help anybody.
Yeah. And this is then also the slippery slope. That's what I hear, where you go off the track of being a facilitator, where suddenly you get attached to a certain outcome, where you're not in service for the group and accept every possibility to be a valid possibility or a possible outcome.
Yeah, I think what's really tricky, though, is some people mistake the acceptance for approval. Like, I do have an agenda. I don't think all options are equally desirable. Like, valid might be one thing, but desirable is quite another. And I think a lot of people have trouble parsing those out. They're like, I can't validate somebody who says something I disagree with. I was like, oh, you can validate them. You just can't agree with them, right? Like, that's actually, I think those are different skills. And so in this way, like, I think that when we aren't open to the possibilities or the different needs of our group, or that we push, I think that's wrong. But I think the illusion that, like, we don't have our own agenda, or that we might not, have a particular voice or perspective, like, that we need to be neutral third parties. I don't believe we have to be neutral third parties. I think if that's your role, if somebody brought you in and they're like, you are to moderate this discussion with none of your own bias, like, then I would say, okay, well, that's the requirement of. Yeah, like, but, like, as much as possible, we don't want you to bring what you want the group's outcome to be into the room. I could be like, okay, but most of the time that I've facilitated, I do have a particular agenda. I do have a particular perspective. It's more that, like, can I be open to people having different ones and not exclude them from the process, and not say, you're just dead weight, like, you're dragging this process back, versus, like, you are meant to be here. You are part of this process, and, like, your movement is necessary for where we're heading. Like, that's a really different orientation. But I don't have to agree with you. Like, I don't have to believe that your opinion is as desirable as mine. I just have to not exclude you from the.
But seeing or including it as an important part of the conversation.
Yeah.
Bringing in a new perspective, and
yeah.
maybe some sand in the wheel that very often helps.
Well, and for me, like, there were workshops where that was the point, right? Like, if I'm doing a workshop and I want to help you unpack these biases, right? And everyone's just being like, no, I'm on board, like, then the resistance is actually part of the process, right? Like, there's a lot of spaces where, like, my deepest hope for this space is to allow resistance to come up and then actually be addressed, instead of it being pushed aside, being like seen as the problem instead of the point, right? Like, and it's just, but is that space on purpose?
Because otherwise there's no transformation going on, right? So
Right.
for me, a workshop has an impact or was successful if there's some sort of transformation in thinking or being or doing. And if everyone comes in with the same opinion as they leave and the same degree of knowledge, it might be a waste of time.
Something that I believe, and I've only been able to articulate recently, is that I think facilitators should be willing to be surprised by their participants. That when you stop being willing to be surprised by people, you really lose something. And for me, again, having this like deep social justice background, for me, I needed to hold the like possibility of like dramatic transformation with my participants, right? And if I was unwilling to be surprised, if I was like, I know your type, right? And I know exactly what you think, and I know exactly why you're never going to change. Like that energy, even saying it, I'm like, ugh, like that energy isn't going to open up any possibility for you to be surprised. Like that's the reason why I think it's important for facilitators to hold that possibility, is because if you don't hold that possibility, I don't think it's going to happen.
And I wonder whether I would even go a step further, whether this must not be a mindset to step into a workshop space, because it keeps you curious and open-minded to look for these nuggets that might surprise you, and be specifically aware.
Yeah, I think that you have to like be open to being transformed by your participants and for people to surprise you. If you don't think people can surprise you, it's going to be probably a pretty exhausting experience, especially when it's like a agenda driven or like a personal or something really you're deeply invested in. If you go in going, this group's never going to change, you know, they're old school, they're whatever, they're stuck in their ways, and like this is just arbitrary to them, and like I'm not feeling hopeful about it, like I think you'll find exactly what you expect. And I am somebody who, it's not necessarily like the secret, like you can manifest these things, but it's more that like people rise to the occasion, I think. And that if you are not willing to be surprised by people, people are never going to surprise you, or you'll miss it when they do. You'll dismiss it as like a one-off instead of like, holy crap, that was amazing, that's possible, you know? So I think it's really, really important.
I like that. Yeah, it's a mindset. It's one of those, sentences you can put on your fridge before going to the workshop. I am aware of the time, and I think you have a hard stop.
I don't anymore, it got moved, but I'm also happy to wrap up. Like I'm happy to wrap up if you do, but I'm like, I feel like we are just scratching the surface. We got so much more to go into, but you make that call in whatever direction you need, but I don't have a hard stop anymore.
I'm glad, because I was thinking whether you had a kind of process, or how do you review your own workshop facilitation? I don't want to call it performance, but I guess it's very valuable that after a session to sit down and to just reflect, okay, what did I do well? Where did I suck? What do I learn?
Sure.
How do you do that?
I would say, in all honesty, I don't do that enough anymore, because I'm on to the next thing. You know, running a small business by myself and facilitating workshops both for the business and outside of it, like I'm like, okay, that's done. What's the next thing I have to send those emails for? What's the next thing that has my attention? So I would say I don't think I do that as much as I should. When I have, there was a thing I did when I was first facilitating, which I think is really useful. And when I would ask people to fill out a feedback form, which if you don't do it in the moment, probably never happen. But if you do that, if you're like, hey, take 5 minutes, fill out this feedback form, I would fill out a feedback form to myself. And it was, I called it my self-feedback form. I'm pretty sure it's online. I'm pretty sure I can link it to you. But I think if you type in like facilitator self-feedback form, you could also make one, right? Just for yourself of like, this is what lesson I learned. This is the thing I want to make sure I never do again. Here's the follow-up I promised. If you were like, oh, I'll send you that link, write it down. And then here's the thing I want to remember if I do this workshop again. That one's, if you do one question, do that one, because you have that right after, right? Oh, if I do this workshop again, I need to make sure we spend way less time on this activity, or we needed way more time on this activity. You know that then, you do not know it when you need to in 6 months and you do that workshop again, or even 3 weeks later. So self-feedback form, that's what I used to do when I just started out. I thought it was super valuable, and would be super valuable for me to do again. I'm not really sure why I don't. I just haven't thought about it in years. When I started doing online facilitation, I did this, I think, for 2 or 3 different workshops. I watched my recordings, and it was no fun, because you see every flaw.
That's very courageous.
Yeah, it was no fun, but it was a workshop. I got contracted to do a workshop for like 600 incoming first year students, and I really wanted it to go well because it was a 90-minute workshop, and I was like, 90-minute workshop, and I was like, I only have one chance. Back to my old self, like I only have one chance. And so I demoed it and I watched the recording. And I called it watching my game tape, like a lot of athletes review, like, hey, we have to watch last week's game, see all of our errors, see all of our flaws. So I actually wrote up an article about how to do this if you want to watch your facilitation game tape, because I went through a process like of the notes I took and all of those things to get better at it. But if you've never done that and you facilitate online, I highly recommend it. I highly recommend it as a useful process. It was not as painful as I thought it was going to be. It was uncomfortable, but you'll notice so many things that you've never seen before. Like I noticed just how long if you timestamp, if you do a YouTube video or you like publish a recording and you timestamp things, you'll also get this lesson of like that intro to the activity was 4 minutes long, oh my God. Or when I said, let's do this quick 10-minute activity, it was 20 minutes long. I say 1,000 times. You'll see all of those things, and you'll also be able to watch your participants' reactions way more than you're able to in person. So you can watch when the energy kind of drops, or you can watch them be lost and be like, oh, where are we? Watch your game tape to get better. I did that, and I do think it made me better. And then I take little notes after, my sessions to try to remember what went well or what didn't. And I just try to put them in the folder of like, if I have a folder for that client, I'll put those reflections in that folder, because otherwise I'll have no idea where they are. And it will just be like, reflections from working with this group. And the next time I'm doing a workshop where I'm pulling information that's similar, I might look at that.
It's so interesting what you're saying about watching the game tape. And I think it's a good one to also watch, or to make sure that you have the gallery view recording, to really watch the body and facial expressions of the participants. Because, for instance, the 4 minutes intro, yes, it can be the 4 minutes intro where you're sucking the last bit of energy out of the group. But it could also be the 4-minute intro where everyone is like, oh, please continue speaking. No, I don't want to talk to my neighbor. The kind of situation you described at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we are so overly critical towards ourselves, especially if we're not used to listen or to watch ourselves performing. I remember back when the first 25 episodes I edited myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I would easily spend 4 hours on editing the podcast episode, not because it was so complicated, but I would constantly censor myself and thinking, oh, here I just took so much time. Why did I tell the story? And I made it about myself. And why couldn't I be sharper? So I would cut myself out. And then I would realize at a later moment that my guest would come back to something that I said. I'm like, shoot, I need to put it back in.
Oh my gosh, yeah, I bet.
And So I think for ourselves, if we're not used to our own voice, it's very difficult to actually judge.
Mm.
But to get a sense of how long things actually take, I think that's magic. And that's really valuable.
Yeah.
From your experience, what are these times? I think they're this group of exercises. And although we do them a lot and we always underestimate how long they take.
Uh-huh. Why do we do that?
And which ones come to your mind? And what do you think is it that suddenly the time just runs out away?
I'm not sure it's exercise dependent. I could be convinced otherwise, but I'm not sure it's exercise dependent as much as our constant like want to do more, like that we're like, oh, I want to really get to this thing, and oh, I really want to get to this thing, and the client's giving me 60 minutes or 3 hours or even a day, like you still end up feeling that way. And that want for constantly wanting to do more, I think, is really at the crux of why we underestimate our time, because we're like, well, if I shave 10 minutes off from every activity, I can do a whole nother one, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that more than the activities themselves, for me, is what constantly has me underestimating the amount of time that people need, that I need, whatever that is. I think the other piece of it, so that's one piece, is just like wanting to do too much. I think the second piece is not having a good understanding of how long things actually take, which is so hard to get in your own facilitations, unless you have basically not even a co-facilitator, but like a support person whose job it is to timestamp essentially as you go, or whose job it is to just be like, yep, that was a 4-minute intro, then we did a 10-minute activity, and then we did a 20-minute debrief. You're not going to know that information. And so that's another really valuable reason. If you do a workshop multiple times, I think watching your game tape is just going to like accelerate your growth around it, or just like your tightening up of it, because you'll be able to know how long everything really takes. Mm-hmm. And I think that skill is important, because if you're like, oh, man, why can't we do a pair and share in 20 minutes? Or like, why does every time I do minute papers, it actually takes 10 minutes? Well, it's probably because of you talking too much, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's because people are running around their house getting their papers, like maybe there's other things you can do. So I think if you run into constantly like bumping up against your time, there's something on the planning side that isn't calibrated correctly. And for me, it's not usually activity dependent. It's usually like facilitator dependent.
Interesting. I wonder to what extent it might also be time dependent, because during the on-site times, I always realized that suddenly before lunch, everything was perfectly time boxed and everything was as planned. And after lunch, something happens and we run out of time.
Yeah.
And I actually wonder whether it's because when we get tired, we tend to blubber more.
Yeah.
When we are sharp, we can put our idea in one sentence. If we're tired, we need maybe 10. And if everyone does that, then every sharing actually takes more time. And then I would think, I'm thinking out loud, that maybe the longer the workshop, the smaller the groups have to be sharing.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Yeah. There's a book called When, I think it's by Daniel Pink.
Oh, Daniel
and
Pink.
It's all about the science of timing. And that one is really interesting. But I think that's a really interesting observation, that stuff takes longer after lunch. I think it does. I think also like you should plan a coffee break, or you should plan like, you have to do a little bit more keeping energy up in the afternoon. When somebody always like, hey, do you want to run this workshop 3 to 5 p.m.? I'm like, oh, okay, but that's a particular, are you bringing coffee like for everyone? Not for me, but like just for everybody else. So yeah, I think that's really important. And I also wonder if even just bringing attention to that would be helpful. Mm-hmm. Like before, if you're going to do like a large group share out, right? Be like, hey, after lunch, we tend to be a little bit slower, a little bit more kind of like, meandering. And I just want to tell people, like, I'm going to give you a minute to write down what you want to share, right? Or I'm going to ask you to try to identify just 3 things. And I'm going to count you down 90 seconds, 60 seconds, 30 seconds, right? Because I want us to keep trucking. I think we just have to do more work as facilitators to make that happen in the afternoon. And I mean, anybody who's done intros where you ask people like, hey, can you just share about yourself like really quickly? And the first person doesn't, and then the second person doesn't, like you've lost it. So that's another reason I think to get probably more structured is if you're like, I can see that this person's energy, you know, like that person shared for 2 minutes and I don't want that to happen again. Okay, new idea. We're going to share differently moving forward.
But then how do you, I love that. I love that that you're raising that. Because, and I think that the online world makes it easier because you can just send them out into breakout groups. Okay, do the longer introduction, the 2 of you, and then come back and just share your name. But when this happens to me, that the first one would start with 2 minutes, 3 minutes of self-introduction. And then I would feel bad to say immediately after, you know what? Let's change the plan, because it's basically pointing at them saying, sorry, you took too much time.
Yeah.
So how do you do that in a diplomatic way?
So I want to give you a better answer, which is don't let that happen, right? Like this is a preventative problem, not a problem with a good solution after that. So the preventative problem is don't let your participants go first. Always go first. Right? Like roll or plant someone, like be like, I know that Margaret's good at this. Hey, Margaret, will you go first? Thank you, Margaret. Right? Like that is the preventative measure. If the group is like, yeah, that's the thing you got to do. Like if you think that if I do this, if I cut in and like, you know, so I've done it where I'm like, I have 2 days with this group. I wish this was going to be 10 minutes. It's going to be 30, but I'm not going to change it now. Like, I'm just going to write it out. If you know you're going to get 3 people in and you're going to have to move on because you're like, I can't, this is an hour workshop and I shouldn't have done intros to begin with, then make that call now. Don't waste 3 more people's time, right? So I think there's a little bit of like decision-making tree of like, how long is this workshop? What % are you about to lose? If it's more than 10% of the workshop, you need to make the call, right? Because like 6 minutes worth or 10 minutes worth of intros or 6 minutes worth of intros is 10% of the workshop, right? That's a lot of, in an hour, that's a lot of value that you're losing. So that's my first thought. And then I would say, the first thought I have is to try to take it back on me and be like, Louisa, I really appreciate getting to know you. And that was really cool. I want to take responsibility that I think I gave us a pretty loose structure for facilitating or for sharing your intros. And I'm realizing that if we do that, we'll take about 25% of the workshop to actually really get to know each other. And I want to know everyone as well as I now know Louisa, and we all know Louisa, but I need to take responsibility that I don't think I set us up for success there. So here's what I'm going to do. Like, I want you to tell me as much as you can about me, about yourself in 30 seconds or in the chat or whatever it is, right? And my apologies on that. That was my bad. Louisa, you're fine. You're good. We all loved hearing your story, right? And but this is what we're going to do moving forward. I think you have to take responsibility and make it clear that like you messed up. Louisa could have done what you were asking her to do, but she didn't, right? Or you should have cut her off if you saw her, right? Like you should have been like, oh, Louisa, I'm so sorry. I know you have more to share, but we're actually at the 30 seconds. And so we need to move on. Like you shouldn't have let her talk for 2 minutes, right? So all of those things are like your responsibility, even if it is the egomaniac CEO of the company who's doing that, like you made that decision to allow that to happen as a facilitator. So I think you got to own that and try to put the problem on you and your structure instead of on them and their over enthusiasm of sharing.
Yeah, such a charming way. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, and it's particularly important to then also do it with the CEO or the hippo in the room.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've done a number of workshops where I tell them, don't tell me who the CEO is. I don't care. Like, I don't want to know. And then I'm like, why is that guy talking so much? And yeah, but yeah, I just think that, like, to me, it is my bad, because people can. I know Louisa could do a 30-second intro, whether that's because I didn't set herself up or she just needed to say more today. Like, that's on me for not regulating that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which brings me to another question. I would be very curious to hear. I was discussing with another facilitator about this process. It's also something that becomes a time sucker, where you do a brainstorm and everyone writes down their ideas on sticky notes. In the virtual space, it goes even faster. And then it's time to share out ideas and to cluster them.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that came up was, okay, instead of asking them to, okay, let me go back just one step. My observation as well is, if you ask the group to share their ideas, okay, just share the big idea or the concept behind the ideas you shared. Don't read out every single sticky note. You'll still have these people who read out every single sticky note. And then it becomes an endless thing where you lose half of the people half the way. So one idea was to, no, I ask you for how you deal with it first.
So I don't know if I've done that exact, well, I've never done it where I ask people to share out what is, especially if we've collected them on something that everyone can see. To me, the point of that is so that you don't have to say, these are my 5 ideas, right? It's because we can all see them. So I'll give the group 2 minutes. I want you to zoom around the mural or look, all around the room. I want you to just read. I want you to just read things for 2 minutes rather than having everybody go around and share their ideas. But that's often because I'm doing that on purpose, right? To try to separate people from their ideas. So I do it a little bit differently, like structurally. So I kind of want to go into your particular question, like, if I wanted people to share out their particular idea, what would I do? Rather than just falling into that trap. I think there's 2 things I would do. One is go first. So be like, okay, so these are the ideas I wrote down, or let me give you an example. So, and I think you should try to do it with your participants, right? Write down your 5 ideas and then be like, okay, so these are the ideas I wrote down. You can see them here. I think what I'm noticing when I read them is that I'm really hooked on this idea of, like, being together in person. That seems to be where all of my, like, energy is, and what kind of, like, themes. Those are the ideas that I have the most energy around, is those ones, right? So you can show people what you mean by, because I think the reason people read them is because they're like, I don't know how to answer the question you're asking. So I'll answer the question I know how to answer. And the question I know how to answer is, I can read these out for you, right? So I think you have to role model what you want to have happen. Or you could even say, like, Kristen, can I read your ones and do what I see in this? And that's the other way I would do it, is to say, actually pair up, like, pick another person's stickies, or I'll pick your person, you two. You're going to read that person's stickies, and you're going to share out the background thinking that you're observing, because I think that's easier probably to see of other people than of yours.
Yeah, I like that. And I like the showcasing or showing how you want things to be done. I wonder whether for many it might also just be too much of a stretch or exercise to be that sharp in their own mind, to step back and see the big picture immediately. I think that's a skill that we might not be able to ask from everyone. Yeah,
I think it is. And I think it's one we ask for, though. And I do think we set ourselves up for failure, and them up for failure too. If you're used to seeing, like, as a facilitator, you are observant to the process, right? Like, you are at least partially a forest for the trees type of person, right? Because it's not that you can't see the details, but it's more that you have the ability to constantly pull back out and go, ooh, big picture. this is what I'm seeing, right? That's a skill that you have ideally, either you were natural in or you have curated or both over the years. And that's not something that lots of people do all the time, right? So when you're like, hey, you just gave me a bunch of trees, can you zoom out and tell me about your forest? They're like, no, like, I can't. So let me tell you about the trees. And then we get bummed out, you know? So to me, it is a skill set. Like that's summarizing and like kind of 30,000 foot view, like that is a skill. I think you can invite people to try it, right? But if you want to make sure that they don't just tell you about their trees, then I think you need to put something else in place.
Yeah. And what came up in that conversation was Gustavo said, instead of asking to debrief on all the ideas, assuming that a brainstorm is usually anyway a process to get as many bad ideas out as possible to find the one gem. So he now asked the question, okay, what is the one idea you would risk your job for? And then everyone just gets the opportunity to pick one idea, and the entire rest is just part of the creative process and will be disregarded until the next workshop. And I actually like that and wonder what it is that I always feel responsible to give everyone the opportunity to at least look at the other's idea. It's this cluttering thing that we don't want to throw away things, right?
So someone gave, I can't remember who it was, somebody gave me this advice, which was they were like, I never delete, like online, the equivalent would be throwing it in the trash, but like online, they were like, I never delete the stickies, I just move them. Like, so it's still there, right? There's a difference between get rid of by deleting, right? And get rid of by like segmenting out, right? I want you to pull your best sticky note to the top of this mural, right? Or into this new section, which we're gonna like all spend time in. All the other ones are still there. And for them, it was just like, it felt less bad to, rather than like delete the ones you don't like, it felt like those still get to be there. We're just not using them anymore. We've just moved on, right? We've just advanced the process, but you still get to see that process. But you don't have to do anything with it. I think, so that's my first slide. It's like, don't delete them, move. And put to the side. And then you could even say like, if at some point you're like, wait, that idea is perfect for this moment, I'm bringing it back, we have that to go back to. The other thing I think is all about the preamble, like where I would say like, we're going to generate a bunch of ideas. It doesn't mean we're going to stick to them. And it doesn't mean we're even going to like get into them as a group, but this is a necessary part of the process of brainstorming, is for us to just idea dump and then move. So if I tell you ahead of time, I'm not going to do anything with it, I feel so much less beholden to it. Like, I do that with, I'll have people do like self-reflections. There's this activity I run about, or this workshop I do about conflict. And I'm like, think about a conflict in your life. Don't think of one that brings like like on a scale of 1 to 10, nothing higher than a 7. I don't want you to think about like the big conflicts in your life, because in 2 minutes, I'm going to bring you back, right? And I'm going to bring you right back. And that's going to be like too jarring a change, right? Or like, that's something I've done a lot, is just tell people, like, help them calibrate. And so I think when you help them calibrate, then you don't feel as responsible to it, because you've already told them, we're not going to look at those ideas. Like, and then you can feel less beholden to them.
Love that. Yeah, it's all about the framing and the invitation.
Yeah. And it's letting you off the hook, right? Like if somebody, and I think if you're getting the feedback of why didn't we X, like, why didn't we use those ideas? Or why did you have us write all this stuff if we weren't going to do it? To me, that's just like a little flag that says like, you needed to do a little bit more framing on that. And it doesn't have to be a lot. It could just be, I'm going to have you use this to help us go here, right? So yeah, if you hear feedback of why didn't we, or I wish we had, like knowing the difference between that two is like, why didn't we? Okay, I didn't do a good job. I wish we had. We were on different pages about what we wanted to do, right? Like you and your participants can have different agendas for a moment, and it's okay if they're disappointed with what yours look like. But if you could have prevented that disappointment by just giving them a little bit of framing ahead of time, I think that's a, that's a pro move.
Yeah. And then it depends on how you frame it and how, gentle you are. Also, to just switch the focus. What I like about the idea of moving the stickies away, just to make space and to not to get distracted anymore.
Yeah.
And also to honor all these ideas. Okay, that's the beauty of online workshops. The stickies don't fall off the wall.
Yeah.
You can come back anytime to continue the work and cluster them until tomorrow.
Yeah.
But then what I also like to do is then to tell the group, okay, we're going to do a clustering exercise, but I don't want you to define the perfect clusters, but just to get a feel of the variety of ideas, because that's all we need. What are the different fields that you recognize, whether they're the correct fields and whether all those stickies are rightly clustered? We don't care, but just train your brain in thinking of categories.
Yeah.
This also prevents of a lot of discussion, where then the group would go, yeah, but this sticky doesn't belong to that cluster instead of this one.
Yeah. Yeah, I just thought about you only want productive conflict, and that's really unproductive conflict, like, or debate, like that type of energy. You want to do that around the meaningful things, not around the things where you're like, the whole point is just to see thematically what are the groups of ideas.
And again, I think this is where then facilitation comes in, because, well, for sure facilitation comes in, but I think it's so crucial because we love getting lost in these nitty-gritty discussions because they feel soothing and we feel in control and we can have our little kind of point of view that we can defend. And because it doesn't matter, we can just distract ourselves from the bigger problems that might be around.
Yeah.
So what I realize is as the bigger the problem or the complexity of the topic that needs to be discussed, the more vibrant are the nitty-gritty discussions.
That's fascinating. That makes total sense to me. And I would say that this is where I think experiential educators are brilliant, because they're almost never talking, like some experiential educators. So if you think about like a team building ropes course, high ropes, you're up in the trees, kind of like walking across like a thin wire, or low ropes, you're just, you need to get 3 people to like pick up that bucket with this large stick and move it over here, right? And it's totally arbitrary little games and stuff. And the process is just to have it is, because the way, what did somebody say this recently? The way someone does anything is the way they do everything, right? So if you have the group try to do this initiative, they're going, like the leader is going to emerge, the bully is going to emerge, the person who's impatient, the people who sit back and don't do anything, they'll show up in all of those characteristics. And experiential educators are the ones who I know who are brilliant at being like, great, what did that teach us, right? Like, how do we take this experience and actually make something of it? And something we haven't talked about, but I really firmly believe is that, and your podcast, I think, would probably transcend this, but for a lot of people, when they're educators or they're facilitators, they stay in their lane, right? They're like, I learn from other social justice people. I learn from other leadership development people. I learn from other, organizational development people. And for me, the reason I think I'm like a facilitation geek is because I learn from facilitators as much, if not more, than the people in my discipline. Or that's what I found to be true. I was like, oh, I'm learning about how to have difficult conversations from people who aren't in social justice, but who are doing, team building, or who are doing like, unlocking creativity workshops. And I'm actually learning a lot from people outside of my discipline. What is it that unites all of those people? And for me, it was being a facilitator. Like, they're all facilitating. Whatever the content is secondary to what I was learning from them was the facilitation part. And so I loved and continuously want to be in part of spaces where what unites us isn't what the groups we work with or the content that we facilitate, but is that we have a passion for facilitation, for the process of working with groups. And to me, one of the things you can learn from experiential educators is like that moment, that little petty discussion, you could debrief that for half an hour, and it might actually be the most powerful thing you do in the workshop, because everyone will have experienced it. You'd have been like, okay, so you all spent about 10 minutes debating topics and the right names and what did you notice about what type of role you took in that discussion? Like, did you participate in it? Did you observe? Did you roll your eyes? Did you check out? Did you go check your email? Like, what did you find yourself defending your position? Did you were you curious about each other? You could spend half an hour, you could spend a whole workshop where that's actually all you do and all you learn from. And experiential educators are brilliant at that type of thing, because they would see the problem, like what we would see as I would say like, oh, I can't believe we just wasted 10 minutes on this like debate about whether we should call it leadership or whether we should call it stewardship. Like we just spent 10 minutes and wasted all of our time. I think some of them would be like, oh, that was incredible, like fodder for a conversation. And like, let's go into that, because that's exactly what we're here to do today, is to talk about team dynamics. And we're actually just going to use that as like an experiential thing that just happened. So I think that's something that that I don't do necessarily a lot, but like, as you were talking, I was like, oh, but you could. And I bet the way they do that is the way they do everything.
I love that. Thank you. And I'll definitely put it on my list of things that I want to do more. Because I think even to just reflect on why do you think was it necessary to talk for 10 minutes about that? And what does it reveal? What are you avoiding? What are you really avoiding by talking about this?
Yeah.
A question that I learned from my therapist.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, for sure. Yeah, for sure. There's a facilitator card called sharing withholds. And until I did it the first time, I would not have believed it works, where you just say like, hey group, we're going to go around and everybody's going to share one thing that they have been purposefully holding back and like not articulating. And we're not going to respond to each other. We're not even necessarily going to do anything with this information. We might not, but we are going to voice it. And everyone kind of sits up a little straighter and is like, oh, okay. And when I've done it, I'm not saying you can do this all the time, but when I've done it, people have said stuff like just from that explicit invitation, and of just like, you're just going to say the thing that you wouldn't usually say. And some people will be like, all right, you're asking for it, I'm going to do it. So yeah, like, why did we feel the need to do that? What are you nervous about when it comes to actually getting into the heart of this? Or is this just a habit and a pattern that you have as a group? It's like just to never get to the good stuff.
Yeah.
So fruitful.
Yeah. And this, yeah. What can we learn from these? Yeah, from these moments where we actually, these are the moments where I as a facilitator get triggered exactly by what you described. Oh, we're wasting the time. That's not where we want to go. Why did I not phrase it differently? Why do I? But then, yeah, to snapping myself out and say, okay, what is there to learn from this situation about what the group actually needs? I think that's the next level where I want to come to.
I think there's the like, did you just mess up and you need to just move on, right? And ideally navigate your trigger in a way to let you get through the rest of the workshop, and then you can beat yourself up more effectively later or whatever it is. There's those moments, and then there's the moment, I think this is like my experiential educator friends, I think, are the ones that really see this and go to it more, which is like, I didn't intend for that moment to happen, or like, I should have changed this, but there's really something worth digging into here. And it's not for me, right? It's not so that I can feel better about messing it up. Because I think when that's why you're doing it like that, yeah, that's when you're taking
then
that.
Then it's about you and not about the group.
Right. But when you're like, I messed that up, but actually I think there's really something here that's worth looking at, that's the move I would make then, But I don't think that's the move to navigate your trigger, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you to point that out. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think it can be a beautiful move, and one that can be really powerful, but it has to be for the group versus you.
Yeah. As everything that we do.
to an extent, at least in that one.
At least, yeah.
But being triggered and figuring out strategies for navigating that, like, it is important, because to me, if you stay in a triggered space, and I love that you said, like, I trigger you. You didn't say this, but to me, what you were saying is, like, you trigger yourself far more than your participants trigger you. Would you say that's true?
Yeah.
I think that's true for me as well. And I would say for the more seasoned facilitators, like, I'm pretty good at being trigger proof for participants. Like, they can do whatever they want, but I have a lot of baggage of things that I know I do poorly, or that I dislike about my own style, or whatever it is. And so those are far more triggering than my participants will ever be.
That no one else would even recognize.
Yeah. Do you have go-to strategies for when you get triggered?
So when I trigger myself, when I get into this overthinking self-judgment mode, I just try to find my center again. Inhale, exhale, doesn't matter, move on. If it gets really bad and I really need time to recenter, then sending the group into a breakout group to discuss something, the learning from the last half hour always works.
Right.
Or voicing it. I think I'm becoming better at just stating what I observe. Also to make sure, okay, is it just me, or am I the only one? So why do I get triggered? Why do I sense that? Is it me in my head, or is it something from the group that I'm absorbing? Because I think many of us facilitators are also very sensitive to group dynamics. And I actually, personally, I enjoy facilitating online much more, because I don't absorb the energy as much.
Got it. Yeah, you're an emotional sponge, and you don't have to sponge as. Do you? So something that I maybe controversially believe, I don't know. I don't think as facilitators we should say I am feeling triggered by X. I think, but saying, like, I noticed a shift happen, or like when this was being said, like, I felt this in the room. Are other people feeling that too? Is like, like, I would totally make that move, but like, I'm feeling triggered by what was just said. Is anybody else feeling triggered? Yeah, you're having a strong reaction to that. But have you seen that?
Wouldn't put it like that. No.
Yeah.
I'm observing, I'm sensing something happened. Did someone else sense that?
Yeah. Because I've seen people do that, and they're like, this is me navigating my trigger, is to like tell the group I'm triggered. And I'm like, no, that's you being triggered. Like, that's not you.
And vomiting your own things on their plates.
I think it's such a, I think it's such a fine line. But to me, as soon as a facilitator says I'm triggered, you're like, oh no, like, I'm not. To me, it signals to the participants, like, you're no longer safe, like, all bets are off, like, I'm no longer present for you. And so you can't trust them to like be the steer in the ship anymore, versus saying like, hey, I noticed this, or like, that comment strikes me in a particular way. I'm wondering, if you can tell me more about that, or did anybody else want to, like, I'm seeing like a couple other faces, do you want to say something to that effect? I just think it's really different. I don't believe there's a place that feels really strong, to tell people that you're triggered. I think it's a really, really risky place to go.
I agree, because for me, feeling triggered, it triggers something so personal and emotional.
Yeah.
And usually we get triggered by our own limiting beliefs, or by trauma, or something bigger than ourselves or whatsoever. And it's not, and since you're there with a specific role, it's not about you. It's not about your baggage. But I think sometimes it's valuable to just assure whether it's you in your head that is sensing something, or whether it's in the group. And therefore saying, okay, I do observe that the energy is shifting. I do observe that since someone said something, everyone started checking their emails.
Mhm. Yeah.
Or something like that,
Yeah.
then it gives agency back to the room. And it
Right.
doesn't, because if I say I feel triggered, then it's suddenly, am I asking them to rescue me?
Right.
So what do I expect the group to do with the information that I got triggered? Because that's my shit.
Yeah. 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 I think too, some people would say, but you know, I know other people were triggered by what happened. And I'm like, it's very different to attend to, hey, I think like what you just said, I'm seeing really affected some people. Do any of you want to speak to that, or, you know, do a 1-minute journal on how that landed, or whatever it is, you know, like that's really different to attend to the triggers of others while that also brought things up for you. Like, I think that's always fair game. It's just the difference between saying, I'm seeing this in other people versus like, this is how what you just said impacted me. And impacted me in this way that is like, yeah, I mean, my definition of a trigger is a disproportional reaction to a stimulus. And that's because it's attached to intrapersonal roots, like things that existed before the workshop, right? And that pull you out of balance or out of being present. Like, it doesn't mean you have to ignore a thing. It means that you want to be able to be present and choiceful in how you respond to something. And that triggers mean you're not in choice. That's to me what it is like, oh, I'm no longer in choice. I am on autopilot. And that pilot says like, you know, like make fun of that person, or that autopilot says like roll your eyes at that participant and move on, or whatever it is.
Yeah, and then you're also giving up your role as protecting or holding the space.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you're out of control. Yeah.
Exactly. There's an article by Dr. Kathy O'Bear, might be called Navigating Triggers, where she breaks down what happens when you get triggered, because it usually feels like a 0 to 60, right, experience. And people are like, I don't know, people say this, and then I, you know, go off or shut down or implode or explode, whatever. I think it's usually one of those two things, like an implosion or an explosion. And Kathy breaks down the different kind of steps involved in the triggering events, what she calls the triggering event cycle, from stimulus to reaction. And then there's a model that me and Sam developed, which is in the book, Unlocking the Magic. It's also online that we can link people to directly, which is about like how you get off the exits of the triggering event cycle.
Yes. I remember the part of the book. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think like for me, that's been so helpful in knowing that there's multiple levels of strategies that you can use. Like, there are strategies that are preventative, that you go in knowing, or rather you go in like that hopefully will protect you. And then there's kind of like last ditch efforts, you know, of like, my last ditch effort, you know, is usually like take a drink of water, because if you're drinking something, you can't tell them something harmful. Like, you can't yell at them, you know, like, just, okay, I just need a second. And it gives you that, versus like mantras or kind of frames that you walk into a workshop believing that will keep you from getting triggered from participants. You know, like, this isn't about me, is like a really generous one, or like, you know, everybody is doing the best they can. Those are like the generous, you know, frames. And then there's just the like, everybody's an asshole sometimes, is like the non-generous frames that are still really protective, you know, and that can keep it from feeling personal, or like, there's going to be someone in here that ticks me off. And instead of being ticked off, you're like, huh, there's that person. Cool. You know, like, and able to be confirmed rather than surprised, by like having that singular experience, or like watching that trigger come up.
Yeah. Which then also for me comes back to the self-awareness piece.
Yeah.
Is okay, just being in touch of how my body reacts when I get triggered. It's usually, and you can see it from people, that there's excessive energy that needs to go somewhere. So people would start to either grab their head or rub their arms or rub the table, because something is happening inside. And then if you're aware of that, then at least you can snap yourself out. Okay, something is happening. Maybe I cannot put my finger on that, but it's time to get some water.
Yeah. Yes, I think when you can know what your body triggers are, because all of us are different, right? Some of us our legs start shaking and some of us our legs stop shaking, right? You know, like you might be like, oh, I'm usually a leg bouncer, and when I'm triggered, I'm still, you know, and like those can be really different reactions for people. But if you can identify what happens to you when it happens, that like somatic awareness is so helpful to see it coming on, and then also to be able to do something about it. Yeah, I think self-awareness, I think that like that feels very abstract, you know, sometimes like we're just like try to increase your self-awareness can feel like, or like you need to be more self-aware, can feel like a big kind of like amoebic, I don't know what the word, like just unclear task. Whereas I think the idea of like tune into what your body feels like when you are present, available, like versus when you're triggered. You know, do you know what that feels like, or can you have somebody else be observant to that who's like a co-facilitator or a friend or whatnot? Or, you know, how good are you at connecting to the energy in the room? Can you tell when people clam up versus when people are open? Self-evaluation isn't always, you know, a reliable resource, but I do think it's a good starting place for facilitators.
Good point. And I wonder whether we actually can grow our self-awareness without being open to the feedback from others. Because
go ahead.
I think that I can only understand how others react to me if at some point I got reliable, honest information about that.
Yeah, I can't remember where I heard this phrase, but the idea of like, don't grade your own test. I think particularly if you're a hyper self-critical person, if you just have like a really loud self-critic, it's very possible for you to have like disproportionately harsh assessments of yourself. When we were talking about the like watching your own game tape, I was like, man, I think a vulnerable but incredibly valuable thing to do would be to swap game tapes. Like, okay, I'm gonna watch yours, you're gonna watch mine, and I want you to tell me all the things that I could be doing better. And you could, you know, scope it out like on a word-to-word level, like how can I cut down every intro to a workshop or to an activity by, you know, 50%, or just like on the whole, where do you think I have largest to grow, you know? And in inviting that, and to me, like if you're both doing it, there's the like kind of vulnerability swap of it. I do think we need other people's perspective, especially when you don't feel like you know what you're trying to do looks like, you know, like if you're like, I know what it looks like to nail this, I've done it before, I can tell you whether I did or did not today. But if you're like, I don't really know what it looks like when I'm like totally on point, then it's going to be, that's going to be an interesting layer to it. But yeah, I do think other people's feedback is really valuable. And I think that that's something that we often miss if you're a solo facilitator and not co-facilitating, is you just don't have somebody to give you that reflection. And that's something I've been trying to get no matter what I'm doing, is even just having the point person or asking, can I bring somebody not to facilitate, but just to be like a support person, and that person being able to debrief it afterward with me. It's so helpful.
Yeah, like a shadowing. And I wonder what would come out if an entire group kind of watches each other's tapes, and then also to get an idea of the plethora of different perceptions of the same situation. Because at the end of the day, I mean, everyone's reality is different anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've ever gotten a workshop feedback where somebody said, I thought it was brilliant, and somebody else thought it was, you know, I got feedback last week where somebody wrote me essentially like a full typed page of how much they got out of the workshop, and someone else wrote, it was a little long. And that was it, you know, like, and so that can happen, and it is helpful when you can get multiple people to give you that perspective, which is why feedback forms are valuable. But yeah.
And to circle back to what you said earlier, the learning, the one wish you what you would tell your younger self is it's okay. It doesn't, okay, there's no other chance, but there will be another opportunity to do it better.
Yeah.
So yeah, there might be these critics and also the self-critics, but next time it will be better.
Yeah, I think that there has to be a way to, like, when it comes to feedback, I think don't ask for feedback you're not going to use. Like, I do think that that is another way we value people's time, is to, if you're like, I know I'm going to run the session exactly the same way next time because this is the way that's been approved by my boss or by my coworkers or my collaborators or whatever it is, then don't ask people, what would you change about the session, right? Like, ask them other feedback. But I think that's really important, is to like honor the feedback that we get and then to try to do something with it. Like if there is something that we want to do, to like spend time with that. Yeah, I think that's important.
And then ask for specific feedback.
Mm-hmm. And to let our, yeah, I mean, I was listening to a podcast yesterday where somebody was like, why do we feel the need to caveat nowadays that anytime we share something, we're like, I don't agree with everything this person has ever said, you know? And I was thinking about, man, I don't agree with everything I've ever said, you know? And I'm me. Like, there's a lot of things that I don't. And so it feels silly to have to say, like, you're going to have bad days, or it needs to be okay for you to like to learn. Like, it feels like that should be a baseline assumption. But in a world of like where we are taught to be hypercritical of ourselves, we often remove that like space or grace from our own journeys. And I do think we need to put it back, you know, and to give ourselves like the fact that not every workshop is going to be perfect. You need to prevent the, you know, you need to do what you can to show up well, and then be okay with what happens.
Yes. Yes, and to acknowledge that the groups we facilitate are usually not as expert communicators as we are, or as the people we surround ourselves within our communities. And we have learned and crafted and how to give feedback, how to listen beyond words, and how to rephrase that and bring it back in a valuable way. And I think that maybe the large majority of the population hasn't.
I think that this might be like a good place to start wrapping up. But I do think that in that it feels like we're almost going full circle. But for me, my like work around social justice for a long time, my work around whether it was gender and sexuality, whether we were talking about race, whatever kind of inequality or marginalization we were talking about, like a lot of the facilitator skills that I gained were far more instructive than any content I ever learned. Like, because the idea of like listening beyond words, that people aren't necessarily, they're saying something, but it may not be the words that are coming out of their mouth that you should be listening to. Like, that has been transformative in the like movement work or in the like conversations that I've had with people, right? Like that skill, that's not to me content. Like, I think that, and I know in the world of like, there's so much content out there. There's so much information for people to learn. And I think I have become more and more passionate over the years of helping people understand, like, I think the process is incredibly valuable for you to pay attention to. And I would assume anybody who's gotten through, you know, a long podcast on facilitation are those people, you know, are the people who are pretty sold on that message. But I do think that like, that's a really valuable thing that we can share as like a facilitation community, is that like our the skills we use to work with groups, like, are the people skills that so many of us have missed in society, and that like the meta skills are worth learning and teaching, and that we have a particular like access point to those things. But I just think, like, to me, facilitation has taught me so much about interacting with people in ways that content will never do that. And I do think it's dangerous when, as facilitators, we forget that like that's hard fought or hard earned information and skills to have. And I also think that's just something that we as a community can give to people. You know, I think that that's something that we have a deep reverence, might be too much, but like a deep respect for the level of impact it can have to be able to listen beyond words. And I do think that that's something that I love about this community, that I would love to see people, give more, or just like share more, with the folks that they work with, is not just the skills, but the content, but the meta skills, or the process.
Yeah. This almost sounds like a beautiful kind of ending. Yeah. Like the message to the facilitation world.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I love that there might be a facilitation world. That's something that, brings me a lot of joy, is just the idea that there are lots of facilitation geeks out there, and they would see in value and connection between each other. And, podcasts like this and communities where people are brought together because of that, I think is really, really powerful, because I think there's a huge portion of people who are doing things aligned with or adjacent to our work who don't see themselves that way. They don't see themselves as facilitators. They're not process geeks. They don't look at the meta lessons. And to me, like, I would love to see, I would love for us to share that passion with the people who are using the tools, but not necessarily see themselves in that way.
Yeah. I would love you to join the Never Done Before community. It's exactly that. And I would say more than half of my podcast guests wouldn't call themselves facilitators.
Oh, yeah, interesting.
Yeah. There's so much to learn and to collaborate on.
Yeah, for sure. There's so many nouns we use to align ourselves behind, and I don't think we all need to start calling ourselves facilitators, but just being able to see that, like, this, that we have so much to learn from each other across disciplines, across mediums, is a gift.
And that our groups that we facilitate can learn from just through experiencing how it feels to be listened and to have a structured conversation. That if you once have experienced it, really, it's something that you will carry on to the next conversation, whether it's facilitated or not.
Totally. I totally believe in, like, possibility models, and that it is almost impossible to do things you've never seen done or you've never experienced before. Like, you can, and a few of us do it, like there are people who invent gymnasts who do moves that have never been done before, right? And you get to name them after them, because that's how rare it is for you to be the first person to do something, right? That's a 1 in a million thing. But a lot of us are like, oh, is that how you do it? Okay, cool. Or like, that's possible. I didn't know it was possible, and now I know it's possible. And I do think that, I mean, maybe that's the message of the Never Done Before, but like, oh, I didn't know it was possible to do that, and now I know it's possible. And I think when we role model that for our groups, when we give them an experience that they aren't going to have, or they didn't have elsewhere, we make it possible for them to do it again.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much for this extended conversation. I think it's the longest conversation I've ever had on the podcast.
Yeah, well, I have.
You promised me to geek out on facilitation, and I'm very happy that we took all the time for that.
Good.
If someone fell asleep after minute 1 and doesn't really have time to listen to this entire conversation again, what would be the nutshell that you want them to walk away with?
So many different ones. So I heard this quote recently, and maybe I'll do this. Pay attention to what you pay attention to. Like, what you notice, pay attention to that. I think that might be a really, we didn't get into that quote or what it could mean or how to unpack it, but I just think that facilitation there's a lot of paying attention in facilitation. There's a lot of paying attention to yourself. We got into triggers, like whether you're, triggered, or are you fully present and in choice with your group. There's paying attention to the group. Where are they at? What do they need? What am I trying to make easier? What am I trying to facilitate? And then there's we got into a lot of self-awareness pieces. And to me, like, the self-awareness is knowing, what do I usually pay a lot of attention to? And is that what I need to be paying attention to today? Is that what's helping me? Is that my secret sauce? Or is that actually something that's holding me back because I get too stuck on paying attention to these types of participants or to this part of the workshop or whatever it is? So I think that we can grow a lot of self-awareness by paying attention to what we pay attention to. And I think even helping other people do that as well. You seem really stuck on this. You seem, really excited about this. And reflecting back and being those mirrors. Yeah, I don't know. That's me trying to get it all in there in 1 minute, but I think that's an interesting idea.
Love it. And you leave us with a great food for thought.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Dum, da, da, dum. So that's the end of the podcast jingle.